regions of Gujarati writing. I'm really fascinated by this talk. Thank you so much. And the last speaker of the session is Sachin Ketkar, um, who is a bilingual writer, translator, editor, blogger, and researcher. So I'm sure we are on to talking about yet another dimension of translation studies. Probably we'll travel the digital spaces and blogging and issues that have to do with the network connectivity and the digital world. Right. So Sachin Ketkar, his recent collection, Skin Spam and Other Fake Encounters, Selected Marathi Poems in Translation, incorporates poems published earlier in his other collections, Jara Sandhyache, Blogwarche, Kahi Ansh, and Binti Shivaitya, Kirkitun Dokatana. His poems have been translated into Gujarati, Hindi, Urdu, Malayalam, and Telugu. He has translated and edited the anthology of recent Marathi poetry titled Live Update, an anthology of recent Marathi poetry. In 2005, he won the Sahitya Akademi's Indian Literature Poetry Translation Prize and the translation of modern Gujarati poetry in 2000. He has recently brought out Changalya Kavita Varche Statutory Warning, Samkalin Marathi Kavita, Jagati Karan Ani Bhashantar, which is a collection of Marathi articles on contemporary Marathi poetry, globalization, and translation. He works as professor of English, Faculty of Arts, the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Vadodara. Currently, he is working on a critical history of Marathi literature. On to Professor Ketkar.
Thank you, Dr. Krish, organizers, for giving me an opportunity for being here, especially Professor Shayantan Das Gupta and Sahitya Akademi for giving me an opportunity to be in the company of such distinguished scholars such as Professor Kapil Kapoor, Professor Nilufar Bharucha, Professor Shubha Das Gupta, all of whom I have always held in high respect. So it's an honor and privilege to be here. And I will be talking about a single project of translation in Marathi as given the constraints of time. And I would like to talk about a different way of approaching translation and conceptualizing translation that one of the leading poets, critics, scholars, translators from Marathi, Dilip Chitre, undertook while he translated the High Modernist, as the term has been, I think, mentioned, into Marathi in the 60s. So I will be talking about that, and I will be also looking at what happens and what is the significance of such a project in modern context, and how do we go about understanding it. So I would like to actually share my presentation. So if it is possible to share it, my PPT. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay. I hope that this is visible.
Yes, it is visible, Sachin.
Yeah, so I have tentatively titled my presentation as World Literature as Apabhramsha and as Kirtan in Marathi. Dilip Chitre's translation of modernist Euro-American poetry, something that Professor Subha Das Gupta touched upon in her presentation, and as Professor Nilufar Bharucha also mentioned, the Bombay-based modernist poets and their translation. I think Dilip Chitre belongs to that generation of poets and translators. So I would just like to begin my presentation by reiterating this very interesting proposition made by the leading modernist Marathi poet Basi Mardekar, where he says that Marathi literature is so heavily influenced by foreign literatures that it is not sufficiently influenced by foreign literatures. By this paradoxical statement, probably what he wants to indicate that there is such a heavy reliance on Anglican or English literary influences and texts in translation in Marathi, that it's necessary to go beyond this Anglican and English hegemonical canonical text and explore world literature at large. Probably that is what he wanted to indicate, because in some way modernism in Marathi is also signaled, as in Merdekar, by move away from the Anglican or British models into more broader world literary text and models. So this statement is very interesting in that context. Modernism, or more specifically modern Marathi poetry, one of the most important poet of modern Marathi poetry is Keshav Sut, one of the earliest Marathi poets, and he very famously translated the poem called The Raven, very famous poem by Edgar Allan Poe, into Marathi as Ghubad. Ghubad, as people who are aware about Marathi, is an owl. So he transformed this whole bird into owl. So can we consider this whole process of transforming ravens into owls as translation and as reception? And given the importance of something like Palgrave's anthology in those days for almost all major Indian Western educated writers at the turn of the century, 20th century, how do you go about conceptualizing this kind of activity? Do we call it a derivative activity, a kind of imitative activity, as many of people have accused these translations of? So whatever the name one gives for this process of transformation, these transformed texts and processes and practices have played a crucial role in development of language of Marathi poetry towards the end of 20th century and 19th century poetry as well, something that Professor Nilupar Bharucha mentioned about development of language. So how do we go about it? Almost half a century later, the noted bilingual poet and translator Dilip Chitre translated Baudelaire's poem The Owl into Marathi, and along with the translation, he also discussed Keshav Sut and the poet Keshav Sut's bird as well, and Baudelaire's fascination for Poe. He discusses all this, and this becomes one of an important document in history of modernist Marathi poetry. And I will be talking about this at some length today. And just a brief introduction to Chitre is that he's a major modernist Marathi writer, translator, visual artist, filmmaker, and editor. Apart from numerous collection of poetry, criticism, and fiction, he has translated prolifically between Marathi and English. From English into Marathi and from Marathi into English, either ways. His translations include Says Tuka, Sri Jnanadev's Anubhavamrut, Virus Alert, poems of Hemant Divte, Namdev Dasal, poet of the underground, and self-translated Shesh, selected Marathi poems in English translation, which he himself translated. And he also translated many important poets in the anthology of Marathi poetry that appeared in 1968. So this is a brief introduction to Dilip Chitre. The ideas of translation, reception, influence, and world literature have undergone significant shift in past decades. Translation, reception, influence is no longer conceived as a simple transmission of forms, ideas, and poetics from the source to target, where the source language is considered, source language and culture is considered more creative. Is considered more creative, elevated, and superior, while the recipient culture is seen as passive, derivative, and inferior. And translation is also no longer seen in conventional terms as involving questions of fidelity, loss, and semantic equivalence or lack of it, but seen as a process of semiotic and pragmatic transformation. Reception of world literature and translation are also seen as expression of cultural, ideological, and creative needs of the recipient culture, and the agency of recipient is emphasized. Hence, analysis of translation and reception reveals the constraints and cultural histories as primary context of these activities. As E.V. Ramakrishnan has observed, in the context of modernist Indian poetry, translation played an integral role in evolving new poetic during the modernist phase of Indian poetry, enacting a critical act of evaluation, a creative act of intervention, and performative act of legislation. These translations, he argues, interrogated the self-sufficiency of entrenched Indian poetry. In fact, this insight is applicable to analysis of translational act that we are discussing in development of history of Marathi literary culture ever since its beginning. Ramakrishnan also notes that the translations by poets like Chitre were foreignizing ones that disrupted cultural codes and legislated regimes of reading and writing poetry. They legitimized experimental writing styles that became a defining feature of modernist Indian poetry, and hence they are integral to the project of modernism in Indian languages. They, Ramakrishnan observed, assimilated a new poetic into the horizons of native readers' expectations, something that Professor Subha Dasgupta also mentioned in course of her presentation, as well as the contesting claims of prevailing aesthetic norms by breaching its autonomy and authority. Ramakrishnan also notes that the commentaries and critical writings on world literature can be understood as translation in the broadest sense of refraction. And it is in this sense that I am approaching Chitre's project of translating modernist world poetry into Marathi. And he published it as a series of translations and commentaries called Adhunik Marathi Kavitela Sat Chhed, 7 hacks into modern Marathi poetry, in a prestigious literary periodical called Satya Katha in early 1960s, on modernist Western poets like Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Hopkins, Rilke, Ezra Pound, Wallace Stevens, Octavio Paz in 1964. And this project can be obvious illustrations of this intense translational engagement with world literature. He calls these translations as Apabhramsha, and the commentaries that he wrote, critical commentaries, as Kirtans in his series. His project in providing Apabhramsha of Western modernist poet and giving Kirtan on them needs to be analyzed further here. The use of the term Apabhramsha for translation instead of Anuvad and Kirtan instead of critical commentary implies an attempt to reconnect the pre-colonial performative practice of refracting texts like the Gita or the Ramayana from one language, especially the elite Sanskrit, in order to reach a wider non-elite audience. These Apabhramsha were particularly influential, I'm talking of Chitre's translations, and played a considerable role in development of modernist language of modernist Marathi poetry. No history of literature or culture is complete if we do not take this process of transforming ravens into owls, the process of Apabhramsha, into account, as this is the process of artistic innovation and process of reconstitution of cultural memory. A note about Kirtan, especially for those who are not aware of what Kirtan is, it's actually, technically, it means to glorify and praise. It's one of the kinds of bhakti, Navada bhakti, or 9 types of bhakti. As a practice, it is public and performative, involving singing, music, and dance. It is commonly found among Hindus and the Sikhs. It has multiple variants and formats ranging from regional, historical, and sectarian variation. And the most popular one in Marathi is the Varkari Kirtan, and Dilip Chitre himself being a major translator of a lot of Varkari literature like Tukaram and Jnaneshwar. This becomes particularly important over here. Varkari Kirtan is a form of exposition and commentary of a particular abhanga. Abhanga is a genre. It literally means unbroken. And it's made up of folk ovi meter, which was traditionally used by women in their everyday domestic activities. And this ovi meter is what constitutes Abhanga as a genre. And a single Abhanga can have extensive discussion and singing and performance by the Kirtankar. And very often it also includes akhyan in it, that is narration. And most of the time an attempt is made to make this Sant Sahitya relevant to the contemporary times. So they connect it continuously with the everyday issues that the audience has. So when Chitre calls his commentaries on Baudelaire as Kirtans, we have to see that he is using this genre in a very different context. He is attempting to situate his own modern translation and commentary from world literature within native cultural practice in order to suggest some sort of continuity with pre-colonial practice and thus legitimizing them. The use of the term Apabhramsha, as I think most of us are aware, is a register which is labeled as fallen or degraded form of language, but it became a prestigious literary register as well during the course of history. So the use of the term Apabhramsha allows him to overcome the issues of rigorous equivalences and the questions of creative liberties, as these questions did not arise within the pre-colonial Apabhramshas and re-narrations and retellings that were prolific. So the term Apabhramsha, literally meaning degraded or fallen register, is oppositional to the norms of ritual purity and sanctity associated with Brahmanism as well as Sanskrit. The poetics of contamination instead of purity is congenial to the poetics of modernist avant-garde, the kind of poetics that Chitre himself is following. The term Apabhramsha also allows Chitre to negotiate the asymmetry between English and Marathi, because Apabhramsha is always from a more ideologically hegemonic language, like, say, for example, English or Sanskrit, to vernaculars. So the use of the term Kirtan also allows him to follow the model of extempore commentary and celebration of the canonical Santa Sahitya in this commentary on world literary texts that I have just mentioned. This allows him to explore how possible it is to situate world literary canon within the native Marathi tradition. He asks, to what extent can a poet like Rambo fit into our tradition? Given the fact that literary sensibility is getting globalized in today's shrinking world. He goes on to say it is not possible to develop creative potential of our language without digesting the influence of modern European and American literature. And it's impossible that our cultural sensibility is enriched without it. Only when it is possible to express the experiences that Rambo or other foreign writers has expressed in Marathi, or at least create a parallel Apabhramsha, that's his term. But Marathi experiences counterpart, only then one can say that slight progress has happened, otherwise not. And then he goes on to compare Rambo's illumination, which he thinks is an attempt to forge a new world language, with a very famous text called Drishtant Path of Chakradhar. Sri Chakradhar is a founder of Mahanubhav Sampradaya, the leading sects in Marathi, Bhakti sects in Marathi. And these kind of comparisons are typical. He then goes on to say in the context of Ezra Pound's poetry and poetics that Tukaram's Gatha is the first modernist work in Marathi, because it expresses organically the personal, individualistic, and the universal for the first time. The Gatha, according to Chitre, unfolds organically like life itself. Tukaram, Chitre feels, is more modern than most of his contemporaries. His contemporaries, Chitre's contemporaries. He also tries to understand Pound as a translator in terms of translation as Apabhramsha, calling Pound Sarjanshil Apabhramshkar. So Chitre's project through these translations and commentaries is to enlarge Marathi domain of modern creative expression, especially when the literary sensibility was getting more and more cosmopolitan and globalized from within by digesting, that's the term he uses, world literature, by situating it within the longer pre-colonial and pre-modern cultural traditions. Chitre's project also reveals itself in the most of his creative writings. For example, one of the titles of his well-known poem is Laforचा Mukhauta Ghalun Mumbait Swataha, which literally means I in Mumbai wearing the mask of Lafor. In his Kirtan, he frequently compares Western modernists with contemporary modernists like P.S. Rege, Vinda Karandikar, Manmohan Nathu, and Mardekar, as well as classical Marathi Bhakti poets like Jnaneshwar and Tukaram. And this reflexive comparativism is typical characteristic of post-colonial modern epistemology. So translation and reception, as I would call it, as a dual transformative hermeneutic, is what is being revealed in this project that Chitre has undertaken. The indigenous Marathi categories of linguistic and cultural practices like Kirtan and Apabhramsha for largely Eurocentric notions of translation and critical commentaries is significant because it reveals the underlying process of dual transformative hermeneutics of modernity, where the Western epistemological frames are interpreted in the light of native indigenous epistemological categories, and also the other way around. That means even it transforms the understanding of what we mean by Kirtan as well as what we mean by Apabhramsha, leaving us with newer understandings of Western categories as well as native/indigenous categories. This dual hermeneutic process results in newer understanding and contextualization of self as well as the other, which is a prominent feature of modernity. A very interesting parallel can also be found in very interesting reading of Hegel given by historian V.K. Rajwade, who says that Hegel is an Advaita philosopher, and he goes on to compare Samarth Ramdas' whole framework, which is Vedantic, with that of Hegel at the turn of 20th century, the beginning of 20th century, where he goes on to say that just like the self is in that linear evolving teleology that Hegel talks about, is mumukshu, or somebody who is looking for ultimate freedom or moksha. And he, in a very detailed way, he discusses this kind of philosophical theory here. So what is interesting for us here is that even the categories of Vedanta and Advaita are reinterpreted in light of the Western philosophical paradigms and the other way around as well. So this is the dual transformative hermeneutic which reception and translation seems to be part of. Chitre then goes on to talk about his notion of world literature while explaining how he turned to translation. He says that when he had to leave Baroda and come to Bombay at the age of 13, he started to search for human treasure of multilingual, multicultural, universal, global self-awareness he had known as a child in Baroda. Chitre's own idea of Astitva Bhan, or self-consciousness, is, as he claims, is derived from pre-colonial Bhakti tradition of Jnaneshwar, is actually a modernist existential one based on awareness of finitude of modern self, instead of the transcendental self of spiritual traditions in South Asia, that he himself has created through this reflexive comparativism. The term Astitva Bhan, which is title of his book, Sahitya and Astitva Bhan, is a very important idea in Jnaneshwari and Amrutanubhav, which he translated. And it talks about the Kaulatrik tradition of Pratyabhigna or self-recognition, which seems to have been a major influence on Jnaneshwar in 13th century. And self-consciousness is a form of spanda. And so these are some of the ideas that he has discussed at length in his translation of Anubhavamrut, a major text by Jnaneshwar. And he builds his own modernist theory, which seems to be of existentialist slant, drawing upon these ideas of pre-colonial tradition. Vinay Dharwadkar has observed that the contrast between the colonial construction of world literature as represented by Tagore and post-colonial construction of Indian world literature as represented by Ramanujan is brought out by the fact that the writers like Ramanujan and Rushdie were suggesting that humanism is necessary to underwrite world literature, need not be located in some spiritual or something Indian only. And these modernist writers, even though they are humanists like Tagore, adopt explicitly secular, agnostic and atheistic positions and are deeply influenced by existentialism. These observations of Dharwadkar are relevant in the context of Chitre's notion of world literature as well. Chitre goes on to propose his own Indian or Marathi theory of translation based on theory of literature derived from reading Marathi Bhakti tradition, which was influenced by what is called, into inverted commas, Kashmiri Shaivism. He states that though a poem is found on surface of the language, it actually exists as a dialogue between the poet and the reader. Poems are not mathematical. They are found in the dhvani, the aesthetic suggested meaning as conceptualized by Sanskrit poeticians. Translation for Chitre is a search for that dhvani. And translation is an interpretation and a commentary by the Rasika or the Saharudaya. The reader sees himself in the place of poet, and inspiration to translate is found in what Abhinav Gupta has called Pratyabhigna. That's what he states in a book called Sahitya Akademi. So Chitre's own theory of translation seems to be using the non-Western Indian traditions of philosophy and aesthetics. What is significant for us is that in spite of his drawing upon these traditions are not simply handed down to him, but they are reinterpreted in the light of modern Western thought as well, and the other way around as well. So Chitre's use of the term like Apabhramsha and Kirtan for his own cultural practice are actually tropes to suggest continuity of his own post-colonial practice with pre-colonial ones. Nevertheless, these performative pre-colonial practices were part of widely different epistemological field and cultural history for that matter. And they were later substantially reconfigured and reconstituted as modern priest-based polysystem by colonial modernity. This kind of anachronistic appropriation of bhakti and pre-colonial cultural practice as tropes is one of the key strategies of legitimizing and popularizing one's own modernist discourse in Indian subcontinent. And I will just end here by just referring to other people who have extensively translated from the West, for example, and written extensive commentaries on them. For example, Vilas Sarang wrote many prose kirtan. He didn't use the term kirtan on existentialist thinkers like Kafka, Sartre, Camus, Beckett, and he wrote regularly in Satyakatha and other magazines. His book Sisyphus and Balakka is a characteristic example. In terms of cultural semiotics, Apabhramsha and Kirtan can be interpreted as an attempt to establish and develop modernist idiom language by establishing modernist text codes in altered semiosphere of Marathi, which has indigenized Western poetics through semiotic translational mechanisms. So this is where I want to stop by, given the limitations of time, I would be very happy to provide clarifications and responses, and I would be happy to have critical feedback as well. So thanks a lot to to Professor Shantan Das Gupta and Sahitya Academy for allowing me to share my views on translation as a reception. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ketkar. It was a very, very thought-provoking discussion of this notion of Apabhramsha and the manner in which the 20th century Marathi translations have shaped by and how they have been shaped by such intellectual influences, and also bringing in the historical, structures within which the 20th century Marathi translations have been forged. And thank you very much for this. Now we will take some questions. If you have any questions for the speakers of this session, please ask away. We will have a break after the QA. Any questions? I think there is a question just popped up. Yeah, please go ahead. Professor Bharucha? I think you have to unmute.
Sorry, more than a question, an observation, and thanks to Sachin, if I might call him that, for bringing back to life not just Dilip Chitre, but also Vilas Sarang. Dilip Chitre we knew through Vilas Sarang, and when I joined the Department of English at University of Mumbai as a young lecturer, Vilas was the head of the department, and through him I got to know Dilip Chitre, and I just loved his Tuka Mane, Tuka says, and you brought him completely back to life. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Any other questions for the session? Here's another. Please go ahead. Benita Sangupta?
Yes.
I can't hear you though. Could you please speak up?
Can you hear me now?
Could you please speak up?
Am I audible now?
Yeah, absolutely. Now you are audible. Go ahead.
Sorry for that. Thank you. The all three talks were excellent. I would like to know a bit more from Professor Bharucha, if it's possible. You mentioned while talking that there are translations in Gujarati from marginalized languages in India. So if you could very briefly elucidate a bit more about the kind of marginalized languages from which we see a translation in Gujarati, and also is it in some way threatened by the kind of English overhauling of translation that we see across languages, from across Indian languages?
Now, Benita, what I meant was not so much marginalized languages as marginalized discourses. I should have been clearer. And I was speaking mainly in terms of the translation of Dalit Marathi writing into Gujarati, which had such a major influence on Gujarati Dalit writers. So that is what I meant. That is available. And I'm sure there are other discourses which are also translated into Gujarati. Women's writing has been translated into Gujarati and marginalized in the sense of not being mainstream as far as male-centric writing is concerned. I don't mean, but I'm sure the Sahitya Akademi can take that into account, and we can have more translations from less well-known rather than marginalized Indian languages into Gujarati. And Sachin is the head of the English department at Vadodara, so I'm sure there can be things which can be done.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Any more questions?
Um, I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say thank you to all three speakers for their wonderful talks. And Professor Ketkar, that was thoroughly enlightening, especially for me, a learning experience because it has answered so many of the questions I am grappling with myself right now about translation, pedagogy. And it also brought to mind some of the transformations that happened, say, during early missionary translations and retellings when fig leaves became banana leaves, similar to how the raven becomes the owl.
Heaven becomes Vaikuntha, right? As you have seen in Krishna Purana.
Yes, yes, and heaven becomes Vaikuntha. Yes, yes. So it was very very enlightening for me, and I have so many questions which I will send to you separately. And I was also thinking about Bhashya and Tika as well as translatorial processes and. Hopefully in the next few days I will send you detailed questions on those and you can probably help me with
I have written about Jnaneshwari as a translation, which is a
yes,
Bhashya
yes,
Tika
yes,
in Marathi
yes.
of a Sanskrit canonical text.
Yeah, I remember that paper. Yes, yes. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
More questions? May I ask a question? Sure.
May I ask a question, please? So,
Sure.
this is to Sachin. This is thank you so much for bringing back Dilip Chitre to us. What I wanted to ask you is that, I mean, of course, there are many questions, but I'll ask one or two. One is that, when when Dilip Chitre is talking about Apabhramsha, is it just, I was thinking of Shudindranath Datta's use of Ekalavya as the translator as Ekalavya. And here you have Dilip Chitre talking about Apabhramsha in the context of translation. So in the figure of Ekalavya, you have a double representation. You have a double meaning. So in the context of Apabhramsha, can we locate any double meaning as such, or is it a kind of, or is it, or does it operate on a different level altogether?
As I've said, Apabhramsha is a term that you find in the linguistic hierarchy, pre-colonial linguistic hierarchy, or you can even say ancient Indian hierarchy, where you have Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Apabhramsha as a fallen language first, and then it evolves into leading literary language later on. So he is translating from English largely, and I'm not very sure from which English translations he is translating into Marathi. Or is he directly translating from French or Hopkins and others, Stevens obviously from English. So in some way he's aware of this hierarchy, and so to bring text from hegemonic planes or dimensions of world literature to vernacular, you see it as an act of Apabhramsha as fallen and degraded as well, as a kind of gesture of negotiation of this hierarchy in some way. So the project seems to be to assimilate in some way the cosmopolitan and whole range of human existential expressions found in modernist texts, assimilate them into Marathi idiom, make Marathi capable of expressing this kind of poetry and imagery, or make Marathi more cosmopolitan, if you want to put it that way. So strengthening Marathi, just like Apabhramsha evolved into a major literary language later on. So he is using this as a kind of trope, as I've said, of negotiating hierarchy and enriching the regional vernacular over here. So it's not in the same sense as it was in Sanskrit or a pre-colonial, but in a more modern interpretation of the idea of Apabhramsha itself. That's how I understand it. So I'm not very sure if I have responded to your query in some
Yes,
way.
you have. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for that question.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for making this very, very wonderful session happen. The speakers and those who came up with those very fascinating questions. Thanks, everybody. We'll meet again for the second session at 1:20. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.